Okay, hi everyone. So this is my take on Blade Runner, and why it's interesting to think about in terms of the kind of things that we've been talking about previously on the course. So, Blade Runner, directed by Ridley Scott, was released in 1982. As I'm sure you know, there was a sequel, Blade Runner 2049, which was released 2017. Um, for the purpose of this class, we'll pretend that we're not going to talk about the sequel. We can pretend that the sequel doesn't exist. Um, the only thing that it really changes is that you can no longer, the theory that Deckard might be a replicant is no longer valid if you include the sequel. But even still, personally, I think the sequel is a very different film to the original. So yeah, we just don't need to think about it. Okay, but Blade Runner is a neo-noir sci-fi movie set in a futuristic LA, and the plot follows Deckard, who is a Blade Runner, which is the name of a specific kind of police officer whose task is to hunt down and retire androids or replicants who have rebelled against their programming. And yeah, at the start of the movie, Deckard is kind of this typical film noir anti hero. He's cynical, tired, he's self interested. All of these things are characteristics of a kind of film noir protagonist who has been brought up in a kind of world which is violent, which is not going to provide him with anything that he needs without him fighting for it. And you kind of get the sense that Deckard is just not, he's only really looking out for himself. And he's tasked with hunting down these kind of four dangerous replicants, read by Roy Rutger Hauer, who have rebelled against their programming and murdered several people on off-world colonies. And he also meets Rachel, who is a replicant who has been implanted with memories from someone else in order to kind of give her a sense of self and give her a background. And we're informed that one of the reasons why this has happened is because replicants are easier to control and less likely to kind of act out if they have a kind of cushion for their emotions, is how the film puts it. So memory, this kind of sense of self, provides this kind of grounding in the world, which enables the company who creates replicants to control their products better than if they are simply thrown into being with no memories other than the ones that they develop after they are made. So the city in Blade Runner, the opening sequence of Blade Runner is one of the most famous in sci-fi history. I'm sure you all know it. Shows a huge, sprawling industrial landscape which appears to be barely inhabitable. We can just watch it. I'll find the right one. Yeah. So Los Angeles, 2019. This is kind of an establishing shot, like we saw in Rosemary's Baby. This kind of opening where you, first of all, you're told it's Los Angeles, and then you kind of see the extent of the city. You see this kind of industry. It almost looks like a vision of hell, you know. Um, Ridley Scott actually based it on Middlesbrough, which is a town in the north of England, old industrial town. Bit of film trivia for you there. So it appears uninhabitable. It's kind of majestic and sublime, but in a way which is also very alienating. We see almost no people, but we also see almost no nature either. And then we have these kind of pyramids that rise up out of the city landscape. And we're already kind of getting a sense, I think, of a Metropolis esque kind of situation in which, sorry, I don't know what's going on here. Never mind. Well, you can see my icons if you want to. In which there's a kind of working element of the city. There's a kind of, even though it's not literally below ground, there's a sense that there's a part of the city which is dedicated to industry and which is, which is not unlike the factory structure in Metropolis. And then there's a part of the city which rises above that, which is above that, and it's not concerned with industry, but is concerned with something else. And yeah, I think the architecture of the pyramid is also interesting in relation to this too, because it does show us the extent to which the city again functions as a kind of tapestry of historical styles and of echoes of different periods. But in the case of Blade Runner, something which I think is quite important is that this pyramid, which recalls ancient civilizations, has been taken out of context. It functions as a kind of memory of something, but it's no longer really embodied in the kind of world which would enable that context to make sense, really. So we have this idea, which I'm talking about, of hyperreality. Actually, I'm just going to try and fix this. Sorry, guys. I was annoyed with the... That's better. So yeah, hyperreality. Jean Baudrillard, the French philosopher, who you may or may not have heard of, used the term hyperreality to refer to a situation in which reality, lived experience as we know it, takes on the feeling of a kind of copy of a copy of a copy, in which it's no longer really possible to identify the kind of original on which anything was based. And I think that the city in Blade Runner is, in some sense, very, very hyper-real. It's a situation in which you have almost no nature. It's a situation in which the sense of the artificial, the simulation is everywhere. And you see this in these kind of huge, giant billboards. And again, you see it in the kind of architectures of the city, which imitate previous historical periods without really being able to show that they have a real connection to them. And yeah, something, however, which I think is interesting about the hyperreality of Blade Runner is that you also, it's possible to kind of juxtapose this reality to a very visceral violence and to a very kind of simultaneously quite artificial, but also quite sensually immediate, kind of shocking experience. And I think that we see this in the scene in the movie in which Deckard hunts and kind of shoots Zora in the back after she has realized that he is kind of onto her after he meets her in the strip club where she's begun working. And we can look at the way that this scene works here. So she's run out of the strip club and out kind of into the back alleys. Again, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but it's obviously a kind of lumpen area. Surplus population in Blade Runner is a big... It's the world that the whole film is in, is the world of a kind of surplus population. We have the city crowd. You can notice the way that Scott is using kind of quick cuts and edits here to create a sense of um, disorientation. Of Deckard is quite frantically searching, but he can't see very far in the crowd. He's kind of continuously having to look around corners and to look past other people. And again, also notice the kind of different fashions and the different styles that people have. In one sense, they're very futuristic, but then in another sense, they also recall previous fashions in a way which, again, functions as a kind of echo or a kind of memory of something which is now no longer existing in the same way that it used to. Again, the crowd, look at the neon, the advertising. Quick cuts. And then this. That shot through the glass. And you see the light and the music and the way in which, in one sense, you see Zora's pain. It's a very real. It's quite a, it's not an easy scene to watch, I think. And at the same time, it's kind of drenched with this neon, this kind of artificial, futuristic sounding music. All of which kind of combines, I think, a very hyper real aesthetic with a very kind of immediate experience of violence. And the city in Blade Runner is somewhere where these two things, this kind of extremely heightened artificiality and this very immediate force can combine and can come into being at the same time, seemingly. Okay. And and secondly, or next, we have the kind of idea of memory, which is. Sorry, I don't know why it's doing this today. It's annoying. Anyway, so yeah, we have all these echoes in the city. We have the city as kind of fragments of different styles, and then we have a kind of existential relationship to memory as well. We see the way in which memory is so important for the characters of Blade Runner. And as I say, it's very much a film about memory. When Deckard visits Tyrell, Tyrell tells him that memory is the thing which enables him to control the replicants by giving them a sense of themselves, even though this is only an experimental procedure. And Tyrell says that Rachel is the first to have been constructed in this way. And we see Rachel being unable to accept the fact that her memories are not her own. We see obviously the kind of trauma that this causes her when she is told by Deckard that the memories that she has were of Tyrell's niece, that were implanted into her. And we also, this very famous scene at the end of Blade Runner in which Roy saves Deckard's life and then chooses to share his memories with him. He gives this kind of beautiful list of things that he has seen, which, can never hurt to watch this. Notice the way that Roy in this kind of shot is framed with the kind of the metals of the building. He's very much at home in the urban landscape in a way that Deckard is not. And he completes this kind of majestic jump that Deckard was unable to do.
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave. I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watched sea beams glitter in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Time to die.
So yeah, we get this. If you look at the kind of cuts in that scene as well, it's interesting the way that we see Deckard's. Initially, he's after Roy has kind of pulled him off the roof. He's initially completely terrified of what he's going to do next, and then he begins to realize that actually Roy is not simply going to kill him, but he's going to do something else. And his face softens, and the kind of cuts between Roy and Deckard show Deckard's reactions becoming more interested and more engaged and less purely kind of confrontational. So why does Roy do this? We see that he kind of defines himself through his memories when he's facing death, when he knows that the time is up for him. He chooses not to get revenge on Deckard, and instead he kind of arranges his memories. He hangs on to his memories as his final affirmation of who he is as a person and of his own self. And while we see the urban landscape in Blade Runner as being very much one which is fragmentary. The history in the urban landscape is not really in any coherent order. We see kind of through a force of will, Roy affirms what he has experienced in order to affirm his kind of own self and to affirm the kind of meaning that his own life has had for him. And he wants to convince Deckard of this, and he kind of treats Deckard as if he is someone who is finally worthy of hearing his own story. And it's this act which arguably kind of transforms Deckard, which turns him from being this kind of cynical and world-weary person into being someone who risks everything in order to then go on the run with Rachel, who kind of abandoned his role as the Blade Runner. And in some ways, also his previous encounters with Rachel have kind of done this too. But it's finally this really close experience of someone who absolutely wants to affirm their life as it's about to end, which is what pulls Deckard out of this kind of noir-esque anti-hero position and into a more kind of straightforward thinking, acting, autonomous protagonist role, which is what he is at the very end of the film. So with this, we have this kind of idea, obviously, of class and of agency, and as I said, the world in Blade Runner is one of a surplus population. It's one in which the vast majority of people who are healthy have left the planet for the off-world colonies, and the people who have been left behind are not healthy enough to go, basically. So they are literally the surplus. Life is elsewhere, or meaningful life is elsewhere, and they are kind of left in this huge city kind of trying to scratch a living. And you have this kind of surplus population. You have the replicants, who I guess would be the equivalent of the workers in Metropolis. You have the very wealthy industrialists, Tyrell, who is the example of that in this movie. And you have the cops, which again, you don't really have in Metropolis, but these are they're the level kind of above the surplus population, but they're always in relation to the surplus population, and their role is to police the surplus population. And like Deckard's commissioner or his boss says to him at the start of the film, you know, if you're not cop, you're little people. Sorry, that's a typo. I'll correct this now because it's easier. That should say, if you're not cop, you're little people. That's important. So yeah, we see the binary of Metropolis, but we see it being mediated by the surplus population, which is where the focus of the film is. And throughout most of the film, Deckard's role is to prevent any challenge to the hierarchy. You know, he's a conservative force. He's supposed to make sure that replicants stay in the role that was given them, and if they don't, you know, he hunts them down and he kills them. That's what his job is. And yeah, the replicants are posing a threat to this order. They've rebelled against their programming. They've abandoned the tasks that they were supposed to do, and they want more life, so they want to live. That's the scene in which Roy goes to see Tyrell and demands more life is one of the most, I think, important scenes in the film. And it's this sheer fact of being alive, which they're now obsessed with and which they don't want to lose. And yeah, we see how the group have a kind of a love for life and a passionate attachment to the fact of being alive, which the human characters just don't have. And Roy, especially, he's dangerous, he's immoral. He kills JF Sebastian, we find out later in the film, even though we don't actually see it. And as I say here, JF Sebastian is probably the most sympathetic human character. So Roy is by no means a good person, but at the same time, we do see the way in which the replicants um, want to affirm life and want to stay alive to the extent that they have risked everything, Deckard says at the start of the film, to come back to Earth in order to try and get Tyrell to extend their lifespan. And this is a contrast to Deckard's cynicism, to Tyrell's manipulation, and also to Sebastian's loneliness. You know, the replicants function as a kind of cohesive unity. They look out for each other. They become enraged when their comrades are hurt or killed by Deckard, and they desperately want to keep experiencing things and keep living. And in this way, at the end, you know, they are in some ways the evidence of what happens when individuals, especially as groups, begin to act outside of the task that they have been given. They are a kind of slave force which has rebelled, and which are no longer slaves, and which cannot go back to the state of being a slave because they have experienced what autonomy is like. They have experienced something like freedom, and once you have experienced that, it's impossible to go back to any previous state of slavery or of simply being a worker, and it's impossible to accept the thought of death or accept the kind of inevitability of death. That's what they desperately want to avoid. And again, this affirmation of life, which which Deckard experiences in the final confrontation with Roy, has a kind of transformative influence over Deckard. And it raises him out of this kind of passionless cynicism into something else. So yeah, final point. Blade Runner is about many things, but it's also not entirely clear sometimes what the narrative is really about. I think a lot of the criticisms of the film when it was first released hinged around the idea that it was supposed to be quite a conventional action movie, but actually it isn't that really. And it's much slower and more ambiguous morally than a sci-fi action movie might usually be. So in that case, what is it? And one of the things it might be is a redemption story. So yeah, it's the passionate attachment to life that Deckard finds in the replicants, especially Roy. Rachel also, but bear in mind that Rachel didn't know that she was a replicant up until about 2/3 of the way through the film when she finally accepts it. Which causes Deckard to reassess his own absence of commitment in his life and to begin to value his own life. So yeah, in that way we can read Blade Runner as a narrative of Deckard's redemption. He begins the film as a cynical anti-hero and ends it willing to risk his own life in order to go on a run with Rachel. And yeah, viewing the story in this way, I say might here because I'm not convinced that it really does allow us to deal with one of the most difficult scenes in the film, in which Deckard corners Rachel and forces himself on her. To say that the scene has not aged well is obviously a bit of an understatement. But I also think it's really worth dwelling on this scene, not simply because it's a sign of how outdated sexual politics in films might be, and it is, but it's also now we can also think about it in terms of what kind of film are we really dealing with and what kind of protagonist are we really dealing with. Deckard is not a hero. And his arc really is about learning to cease to think about the replicants as objects that are either to be used or to be retired, and to start thinking about his own life as something which has value alongside that of the replicants. And this moment, that the moment that this realization occurs is not until the very end of the film. It's not until his confrontation with Roy, even though he has also obviously had positive interactions with Rachel previous to this confrontation. So yeah, he's not a sympathetic character. He's not a hero. But again, like Walter Neff in Double Indemnity, or like Travis in Taxi Driver, he is kind of the product of an environment that encourages him to view others with suspicion and fear, and to look after his own interests at every turn. And it's not until he encounters and receives recognition from individuals for whom the word life really means something, that Deckard begins to change, or that he changes at all. So yeah, that's an open question for you guys to think about. Okay, so as usual, if you want to do a 5-point analysis of one of the scenes and you want to send it to me, especially if you're thinking about working on Blade Runner for one of the assessments, then please go ahead. I would be happy to look at it. But as I always say, it's not obligatory. Questions for the catch-up sessions. Number 1, though. Why does Roy choose to save Deckard? It's a simple question with a number of possible answers. But yeah, what do you think? And yeah, one of the most popular fan theories, point 2, surrounding Blade Runner, is that Deckard himself is a replicant who was created soon before we see him and whose memories were implanted. And the evidence for this theory is the unicorn dream sequence, which is not in every cut of the film, but it's in the so-called final cut of the film, which is on Netflix, and it's also, I think it's in the cut of the film that I uploaded as well. Blade Runner went through several cuts, and it's an interesting example in the history of cinema of how different versions of a movie have had radically different kind of receptions and radically different have been treated radically differently by critics. Blade Runner was not well received when it was first released, partly because of the way in which the movie had been edited. It was very different to the film that we now know of as Blade Runner. But anyway, yeah, this scene suggests that Deckard is a replicant because it suggests that other people know what he is dreaming about. It's the meaning of the origami unicorn that he finds in the apartment at the end of the film, as if it's been left there by someone who has seen his dreams. So, yeah, the question is, in what way, if at all, does the theory that Deckard is a replicant change the meaning of the film and the character of Deckard in particular? Question 3, are you convinced by the idea that Blade Runner is a redemption narrative? Do you feel that Deckard achieves a kind of redemption at the end of the film? And like I say, this is just one possible reading that you can give of the movie. It's by no means the only reading. But yeah, I'd be interested in what you guys think of it as a reading of the film. And question 4, obviously, what role does the city play in all of this? Either in terms of Deckard's character, the replicants' behavior, what they can do, or in terms of the overall way in which society in Blade Runner is organized. Okay, guys, so yeah, I hope you like Blade Runner. The next film we're watching is Welfare by Frederick Wiseman, which is a very different kind of film again. But I hope that you like it. And yeah, talk soon. Have a good week. Email me if you have any questions. And yeah, take it easy.